Students. All right, so today we're going to continue with active translocation via mass flow in 9.2 phloem. So last time we looked at phloem loading and we saw how phloem was able to load up inside the sieve tube cells. And we saw that even though the phloem loading can happen passively via plasmodesmata, we also learned that it can happen apoplastically, which is an active transport process that requires ATP. So then that means that the sucrose that comes from the source needs to go through the companion cell and then needs to be actively uploaded into the phloem or into the sieve tubes and make up phloem. So today we are going to talk about what happens once those sugars from the source reach the sieve tubes and are now known as phloem, which is able to move throughout the plant. So let's start with the essential understanding. So the first essential understanding is that high concentrations of solutes in the phloem at the source lead to water uptake by osmosis. So the source where glucose is made, that's the leaf cell, right? So this is the mesophyll cell. So this is the leaf, this is the source. Now we know that glucose, which is a monosaccharide, is converted into sucrose. And we know that that sucrose then travels into the companion cell, which is this cell right here. And then that sucrose needs to go into the sieve tubes, or the sieve tube cells, which are the cells that make up the sieve tubes, right, that are going to carry phloem. So the sucrose is actively transported most of the time, and this is what we talked about in the previous lesson. So once it's in there, it's in high concentrations. So that's the first essential understanding. You have high concentrations of solutes. That solute is sucrose in the phloem right here, located in the sieve tube cells. And that leads to the water uptake by osmosis. So notice that xylem, carrying water up from the root to the rest of the plant, it's right next to phloem, right? They're part of the vascular bundle. Remember that the vascular bundle is xylem and phloem together. So if you think of the sugar component within the sieve tube cell as being hypertonic, right, that means you're going to have high solute concentration. So then, of course, water is going to be attracted to that high solute concentration within the sieve tube cells. So water is going to move from the xylem to the areas of high solute concentration, or those hypertonic areas. That means that more water is going to come in, and then that means that the buildup of water is going to cause the hydrostatic pressure to increase. So here we have a hypertonic solution with a high hydrostatic pressure. So then that means that since you have a high hydrostatic pressure building up in this location here, that means that it's going to be moved into areas of lower pressure. And that is going to be the sink. So that movement from high pressure to low pressure is called mass flow. Okay? And if we move this a little bit and we look down here, right, we see what's happening here, right? So the sugars are moving from a hypertonic solution, high hydrostatic pressure, to areas that have a lower hydrostatic pressure, and that happens to be the sink. And in this particular case, it happens to be the root cell. But remember that the sink can also be the fruit. The sink can also be the seed. Now, As water moves from the xylem into the phloem, that's what makes that sap, right? So now we have translocation of sucrose as it moves down to areas of lower hydrostatic pressure. And then that phloem is going to be unloaded again by companion cells. So notice how the sieve tube cells here can't really do much other than transport the phloem, right? And that's why we said that these sieve tube cells need these companion cells for the loading that's happening here, and then for the unloading that's happening at the sink. So now at this area of unloading, the solution becomes hypotonic because there is less solute. Because this solution is now hypotonic means that water is going to move away, and water is going to move back into the xylem. After the phloem finishes unloading into the companion cell, then it can reach the sink. So moving down here, this is just a recap pretty much of what we just said, right? Raised hydrostatic pressure causes the contents of the phloem to flow towards the sink. So you're going to find a higher hydrostatic pressure at the source because that area is going to be hypertonic. So water is going to move towards that area. And at the sink, you're going to find lower hydrostatic pressure. And then the solution here at the sink is going to be hypotonic. That's the next essential understanding. So here we see two mechanisms by which phloem is unloaded through the companion cell. So this is the companion cell. Here we have the sieve tube cells, and here we have the sink. In this particular example, the sink is fruit, and in this particular example, the sink is the root. So as the phloem starts to unload into the companion cell and then into the sink, we know that water is going to leave the sieve tube and go back to xylem, right? This is going to ensure that there's always a lower hydrostatic pressure at the sink. Because remember, that's the direction in which the phloem needs to flow. It needs to flow towards the sink. Now, once the sugars, for example, sucrose, right? We said that that's the most common sugar that's being transported in phloem. Once it reaches the sink, then if it reaches a fruit, then it's going to be involved in fruit metabolism. And it's going to use energy for metabolites that the fruit needs. For example, as the fruit is growing, it needs energy to grow. And as the fruit is ripening, that is also a hormonal control that requires these metabolites. So that's why we've tasted fruits. We know that they're sugary, right? This sucrose here in fruits can sometimes be converted back to fructose. And that's why we find a lot of fructose inside fruits, okay? Now, if the sink happens to be the root, then this sucrose here is going to be stored in what we called tonoplasts. So tonoplasts are these structures inside vacuoles that store these sugars. Now, why would a root need to store sugar? Well, think of tubers that are fruits, but we don't think of a potato being a fruit, right? But it's pretty much the fruit of that plant. So a potato is a tuber or a bulb of some sort. They are underground, right? So they still need energy and they still need a food source, and they get it from that storage here in the roots. Also think of what happens in the winter, right? When the plants that live in cold weather, they lose their leaves. So if they lose their leaves, they're losing a lot of their photosynthetic output. So then that means that these plants that live in cold weather, they need to have a good amount of of sugars stored in the roots, right, to withstand winter. You ever wondered about that, right? How do plants do it in the winter? That's because they have a lot of sugars that can then be converted into energy stored in the roots during the winter.